Middle East, a modern name for a region shaped by millennia of conflict and faith. From the Crusades to the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, its history is marked by sacred visions and imperial designs. And we understand its present shape by studying its layered past. I'm Paul Lay, and I'm delighted to be joined by Gartrell, who is lecturer in Roman history at University College London, UCL. And we're here to discuss the Roman imperial cult and the way in which it spread into the east of the empire. We'll start, I suppose, at a very famous date, perhaps the most famous date in Roman history, the Ides of March, 44 BC. Amber.
Yeah, so the Ides of March obviously is very well known because of the death of Julius Caesar, who, after rising through military and political ranks to really consolidate power at the end of the Roman Republic, not that he necessarily knew it was the end of the Roman Republic, will lay dead at the foot of Pompey's statue, one of his great enemies, after being executed or assassinated, depending on which version of the story you go with.
Which one do you prefer?
It depends, really, because I think it's a bit of both, because it really depends whose story you go with. The story that survives predominantly comes from one side of that narrative. So Brutus and Cassius, the famous assassins, are given wonderful speeches in Shakespeare, but less so in some of the other ancient evidence. Instead, the man who gets to tell most of the story about the death of Julius Caesar and the aftermath, which we will go on to talk about later on, where he becomes Divus Julius, the deified Julius Caesar, is his grandnephew and eventually adopted son, posthumously Octavian, who will go on to become the first Emperor Augustus, and oversees the death of Brutus and Cassius, and then has a very long time to tell the story that Julius Caesar was a politician and a magistrate of Rome who was slain, assassinated illegally. So that's the story that has the most legs, but there's probably still some truth in the other one.
And this is the beginning of this imperial cult.
Probably. It's one of the beginnings of the imperial cult. The trouble is, when we're talking about the imperial cult, a lot of our sources differ depending on their perspectives, when they're writing, and who they're writing about. So there are some tropes that can be fallen into. Good emperors don't want to be worshipped. Bad emperors love it. They don't tend to end up terribly well. Caligula, Domitian. The good emperor is someone like Augustus, Trajan. Oh no, I couldn't possibly be worshipped, but you're forcing it upon me. So there are several beginnings, but some of the other issues of our evidence is there's probably also more than one imperial cult. We should probably be thinking about imperial cults. So what's happening in the city of Rome, in Italy, out into the Hellenistic East, but also into the Latin West, they're all very different. And it changes quite drastically across the Roman Empire. And a lot of our sources are writing from that later period, at which point the imperial cult doesn't seem strange at all. It's obvious what happens, that nearly all emperors, and indeed eventually emperors' wives, sisters, children, become deified. And they perhaps give a false sense of, well, it's just what happens. Whereas in the early days, so Julius Caesar, Augustus, the very early Julio-Claudians, they're still trying to figure it out as they're going about what's going to be acceptable here, there, and somewhere else. So it's a really much messier picture of developing cults than just the singular narrative we're given quite often that's neat and tidy.
Yeah. And where does, in this pantheon of gods, where does a figure, when he becomes divine, where does a figure like Augustus sit in his pantheon?
That's a really interesting question. So there have been arguments that there have always been levels of ancient deities. Some deities are more powerful than the others. So the Olympians, Jupiter, Zeus, king of the gods, far more powerful than lesser deities.
There's a hierarchy.
There's a hierarchy. So gods that might not be often heard of, Asclepius, quite powerful, but not at the same level. And then down to actually relatively small gods who might just be in charge of a particular area. Marriage, a river. The first ploughing has its own god, Vivactor. So there's always been sort of this idea of a hierarchy. And so, yes, the question is, where do you put the deified emperors in that? And they're probably above sort of what's called the Sondergötter, so the single priority deities, but not quite at the level of the Olympians. However, there is one source, it's a comedic text, it's called the Apocolosyntosis, which is often translated as the pumpkinification of Claudius, potentially written by Seneca, which actually has a council of the Olympians who are going to decide whether or not Claudius deserves to become a god. Because that's the other thing. Imperial cult in the city of Rome is not necessarily guaranteed for everyone. Augustus is amongst that council of gods who decides. So we might also have some Augustus, one of the first, might retain more longevity and more power.
So he has a primacy.
He does. Same with Julius Caesar up to a point, but Augustus even more so. So his cults seem to stick around slightly longer than those of, let's say, potential emperors who never survived long enough, who might be worshipped during their lifetimes, whilst they're important as potential heirs. But after death, maybe they're not quite so important anymore, and they move on.
And are they immortal?
During their life?
Well, yeah. I mean,
yes.
Are they considered immortal in the way that, say, the major gods?
Ooh, probably not to the same level. I mean, so there is the idea that some of the major gods are athanatos. They are not allowed to be around death. Yeah. In fact, there's quite a few myths that revolve around that idea. There are some rules about the issue of ritual pollution that might play a role, but it seems to be more in their role as priests.
Right. Okay.
So Augustus, for example, has to stand with a curtain between himself and the body of his dear friend Agrippa when he pronounces the funeral oration. But there's no connection that's anything to do with divinity at that point. It's more to do with priesthoods.
Yeah.
But yes, I mean, I think that there is the idea that they will die. And in Rome, at least, that's the moment of transition. The funeral is the moment they become an official god in Rome.
Right.
In the Hellenistic East, they may be given divine honors and worshipped as a god or like a god during their lifetime.
And you talk about this idea of precedent, the status of the gods, the rituals of them, the way in which they're looked upon has precedence. Particularly, I mean, this is a fairly straightforward transition from the Greek world to the Roman. There's quite a Hellenistic precedent for these, not least in the obvious figure of Alexander.
No. So yes, that's very much true. That was a long idea held that scholarship argued very strongly that a lot of these ideas came solely from the Hellenistic East. It's probably not quite as black and white as that these days. There's allowed to be a bit more variety. But yes, more recently, Hellenistic kings, so Alexander the Great, is associated with the god Zeus Ammon in particular, because he visits, we're told, although, again, there are multiple stories about this incident. He visits an oracle as part of his campaigns in Egypt, at which point he is told he's the son of the god Ammon-Ra, who is associated with Zeus Ammon, and thus his campaigns are sort of divinely sanctioned.
Right.
And perhaps that explains how he's been so successful. The gods are on his side. How could anybody have stood against the son of Zeus?
So there's a providential element.
Yes, there certainly is. So there's an idea of legitimation of power, that if you are closer to the gods than anyone else, well, the gods favor you.
Yeah.
And that might be biological descent. A lot of Romans and Greeks, especially from the noble families, claimed to be descended from gods. Julius Caesar claimed descent from Venus.
Yeah.
For example, Mark Antony claimed descent from Hercules.
Really?
Yeah. That one didn't sort of get quite so much leverage, but again, there's a bit of a smear PR campaign against Mark Antony. Or by claiming that you are the most favoured by that particular deity. So that's probably what's at play here, but there's a sort of a circle of propagation of that argument. You're successful, And thus that proves that the gods are on your side. And the gods are on your side, so you are successful.
Yeah, and the obvious example of that would be victory on the battlefield.
Yes, that's very
divinely sanctioned.
Very much so, and indeed sometimes divinely achieved.
Yeah.
There are reports of epiphanies of gods actually ensuring that the right side wins. The Battle of Marathon, for example, is.
And there's even echoes of this in Constantine as well.
Yes, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Yes, a different god, but he seems very much to be picking up, on similar sort of signs, the sign of the cross.
Traditions.
Yes.
Yeah. The imperial cult, when it becomes established, and it would be interesting to see how it's established and what the timeline is for that. But also, is it seen as a tool of statecraft? And is it also, or is it instead, a genuine religious movement, this idea of the imperial cult? Or is it a mixture of both, I suspect?
I think I would err on the last option, so it's probably a mixture of both. But I don't think either negates the other. So if we return to immediately after the death of Julius Caesar, there are reportedly spontaneous, not official deifications, although that does come out fairly quickly once Octavian starts pressuring the Senate to do so. By 42 BCE, it does seem that Julius Caesar is quite on his way to actually becoming officially. But even before that, almost immediately after his death, at the point he dies, and where his funeral pyre is, the people of Rome, so not the Senate, not the elites who might have been a bit angry with him for hogging all the power, but the people set up an altar, start bringing gifts. So it starts very quickly, if we want to count that as imperial cult, which we could do. If we're talking more formal state-sanctioned imperial cult, it takes a little bit longer. Octavian, for much of the propaganda reasons we just said, has a particular reason for wanting to encourage Julius Caesar to be legitimized as a god, because that makes him the son of a god. That makes him special. And he's about 18 or 19 at this time, so he needs everything he can get to legitimize his claim for power. When that's been consolidated for him, again, relatively quick. So, if we say 30 BC is when he sort of really consolidates power, we start seeing sort of hints of it creep in, divine honors, pouring a libation to him after every meal, oaths for his safety. But it takes until his death for him to probably be formally worshipped in Rome. But out in the Hellenistic East, we have it in the teens. So it certainly starts appearing at 1819. There's a coin suggesting that there is already at that point a cult to Augustus and Rome.
And that coin's a rather interesting image as well.
It is. It's a very simple image in many ways. So there's not much you can do to argue against it. So it simply depicts a hexastyle temple, so 6 columns of a temple, rather simple. And across the architrave, so just under the triangular pediment, it says Roma et Augustus. No, August. Hasn't quite managed to fit Augustus on from the community of Asia.
Yeah.
So yes, it seems quite clear that that is being shown is a representation of a cult site to Augustus being set up at that time. And that's from Pergamon.
I always find it interesting talking to classicists or scholars of late antiquity, because I think one of the great challenges in it is, I think it was Martin Goodman who said this, that we're so drenched in Christian ideas, Christian values, regardless of our religious beliefs or not, and religious backgrounds, that it's a real challenge for a person like yourself, a historian like yourself, to immerse yourself in that world from a contemporary perspective, a Roman perspective, or of the subject peoples of Rome. How do you manage to do that? What is the key to that?
It's a real problem, especially for ancient history, which has been studied for centuries. Scholars quite often, they often liked drawing a continuum of religions to get to the correct way of doing religion, which was often theirs. So starting from polytheism to multiple gods, to henotheism, where there might be multiple gods, but there's really one in charge, to obviously monotheism. And that was, of course, the correct way of doing anything. So, the rustic Romans just didn't quite understand it. to an extent, that appears in Dante. That's why you get those who didn't have the opportunity to be the virtuous in there as well. So it is a real difficulty, especially in ancient history, trying to go back and unpack things that have become orthodoxy in the scholarship, to go back and actually go, well, hang on, do we still agree with that? The way I try and get around it is I accept what the Romans tell me. I'm not terribly concerned with theology. I'm not terribly concerned whether do gods actually exist? Do the gods actually appear on the battlefield and save the day? The fact that they tell me they do, they believe they do, whether that's for political reasons or religious or both, which I would always argue probably is the case. The fact they've put so much time and effort and money, and the Romans in particular, they care so much about the correct performance of rituals because it mattered to them. Because if you did the ritual wrong, well, you might upset the gods. And if you upset the gods, bad things tend to happen. Yeah. And that was often seen, particularly in, as I say, the monotheistic line of religions, as being proof, well, they don't actually care about their religion, they just do it. Yeah. It's very robotic. We just do this.
It's just ritualistic.
It's just ritualistic, absolutely. So that's often the orthodoxic versus orthopraxic debate. So the thinking religion versus the doing religion. Yeah. And again, I've never quite understood how doing precludes thinking. But such is the narrative. But I take it entirely the opposite direction. You know, the amount of effort and money they put into trying to maintain the relationship with their gods, whether they are the main gods or indeed the imperial gods, there's clearly quite a lot of concern about trying to hit the right level to please them. You know, I think that should stand on its own. Do we still need to be critical about it? Of course we do. Can we trust Cicero in everything he says? Of course we can't. But if they're telling us what they believe and showing us that they believe, I think going hyper-skeptical is anachronistic, as you were suggesting.
Skeptical, but not hyper-skeptical.
Exactly, yes. Well, just yes, being aware that there are many probably different beliefs. There might have been some people who are completely skeptical. Some politicians who are only worshipping Augustus, Divus Augustus, Divus Julius, Divus Traianus, because it works for them.
Yeah.
But there might be some that truly believe as well.
Of course. And you're hinting there as well of this, in this pantheon, the geographical spread of it. And we're talking about the way in which this imperial cult spread to the east and the way it spread. But it doesn't spread into virgin territory. There's something there that's already there that develops that imperial cult as well. And there's a mix of local rituals, of local gods or local divinities, whatever. How does that work, that process? Because there obviously is this spread. We're talking about a vast empire in the East here. How does that work? I mean, what are they picking up on? Why are they so open to this idea? Why is it such fertile ground for this cult?
Yeah. Well, I think it comes back to sort of where we started earlier, which is the idea of Alexander and sort of the Hellenistic kings who have already laid down some of these templates that work. How do cities or nobles, elites in the era, or even the average person relate to a king who has the power of life over death over them, same as the emperor could, technically. So there are already divine honors given, hymns given to the Hellenistic kings. So the followers, the successors of Alexander, who ruled in this area, sometimes more nicely than others. And so there always seems to be a template that follows. And we date the Hellenistic period ending, by the way, in 31 BC, which is the Battle of Actium, when Augustus is in the Hellenistic East. And indeed, Mark Antony makes use of a lot of these. And Cleopatra, you know,
who is a descendant of Pompey
she is.
As well.
Yes, so she's depicted quite often as, you know, in the ways of the pharaohs as Isis. Mark Antony goes around. There's this idea of in Plutarch of Dionysus and Isis meeting. So it's also not that remote. So it's quite easy to slot in. And so probably what happens, and again, the trouble is sometimes what we get is the result rather than the negotiations of how we got there. Yes. Yeah. But what seems to happen at sometimes is that actually the impetus comes from different communities that reach out to Augustus, to Tiberius, to the emperors, or to the Senate, send embassies to Rome and go, we'd like to offer divine cult, please. That would, you know, we think you're powerful, we think you're great, we'd like to honor that. And again, good emperors go, oh, okay, you know, you're going to have to push me into this. So we get some limitations put on. So there gets to be sort of this idea that you can only have one center of the imperial cult for an emperor in a region.
Right.
It's called the neokoros. And then it becomes competition as well in the area. Who gets to claim that we've got the imperial cult
And this
center?
presumably is where the local elites come in for this bidding war, I suppose you might call it.
Yes, I mean, it definitely seems to be a bidding war. So we do have an account of various cities of Asia Minor basically coming to Tiberius and going, oh, you should give it to us for these reasons. They almost seem to be basically there together in Rome. All have sent deputations and embassies, and they're all making their cases for why it should be us. Is it because, oh, well, we helped your army, the Roman army, a long time ago. We have a relationship through Aeneas. We have very stable earth. That's actually one of them. We haven't had an earthquake in a while, which I have to say is wonderfully practical. So it seems that then there's a choice to be made. And yes, as you say, the local elites get a lot out of this. The prestige of being the priest of the imperial household in the local area, but it's also potentially a way that they can, if you're particularly ambitious and you don't want to just stay in your home city anymore, potentially moving elsewhere, moving to a grander city, moving into Rome. Perhaps eventually taking on magistracies and offices off the back of this.
And what's, in this bidding war, what is the secret to that success? I mean, how do you make a bid or a proposal effective? What's the best way of making it effective? What are they looking for in Rome?
I'm not sure they know either. So I think that's the thing. They're very much working it out. Some of it seems to be on ideas of loyalty, which comes back to that idea of deserving, of legitimizing, that it shouldn't just be given to anywhere. Because sometimes they seem to be given to not the most prominent city in the area. Sometimes they seem to be given to sort of rather less powerful cities.
But is that because of a background of loyalty, a background of service?
That seems to be the case for the ones we have evidence for. We don't always have the evidence. Sometimes we just get it. We're told in one form of evidence that this city has that neocorate of this particular emperor. We're like, oh, okay. How did that happen? But yes, there is very much competition, probably both between the elites to be able to be the ones to make that claim. Quite a good way of getting attention of the emperor. Go, well, we're the most loyal to you.
And there's economic reasons as well?
Probably. Probably not straightforward, you know, you're going to get a tax rebate or cash in hand for it. But you could certainly, you know, wonder whether or not if there was an issue, you know, you could then use that, well, we are more, you know, we have given great games for you, great festivals for you. We've professed our loyalty. So if there's then inter-city competition, well, maybe that'll give us a one-upmanship.
Just that edge.
There are some accounts where they do get imperial aid. So there's earthquakes, for example, and then sometimes they'll get aid sent by the emperor or by the governor, the emperor via the governor of the area as well. But I don't know whether they're probably planning on sort of just having that in reserve to be able to claim greater loyalty in the future.
And what are the symbols? I mean, you mentioned the coins. What are the rituals? What are the symbols involved in this cult?
So there will be sacrifices, shrines, temples, some grander than others.
So this, again, is nothing new. It's built on...
But that's the thing. So it's very much speaking the language of a polytheistic religion. Material, you know, grand materials as things being made out of marble rather than cheaper stone, marble facings. So you're going to get some gold involved, some statues. Festivals. So there might also be transitory elements. So sometimes the imperial cult seems to be added on to existing festivals. So if there's a 3-day festival that's already established, we'll add a 4th day, and that'll be the Sebastea, which is the translation of Augustus-ish into Greek. Some do whole new ones, whole new festivals. Sacrifice, which involves a procession, involves a party, often involves a feast afterwards, which again brings together a certain selection of people in the area, and statues. not all of which we don't often keep. They don't often stick around, but sometimes we find the bases.
Right.
But the difficulty sometimes of some of the imperial statues is we don't know whether they're cult statues, so they're deified honours, or they're statues.
And does it end, the cult, end with the arrival of Christianity as a Roman religion, the final acceptance of it, or does it linger on?
No, I mean, it still lingers for a bit longer. So Christianity and traditional Roman religion coexist, sometimes more happily than others, for quite a long time.
And they're all building on local traditions as well, that are much deeper as well, as you've said.
Yes. So some of it probably continues. I mean, again, we've also got to be careful. Are we talking about only state-level cults?
Yeah.
You know, the official ones, and where there are sort of the transitions that, okay, no, now we're all Christians.
Yeah.
No, we're not. Yes, we are.
And more organic ones.
Yes, more organic, more personal ones.
Yeah.
So we hear, for example, of statuettes of emperors in household shrines. So there's no way of saying whether those end at the same time and everybody throws out those statues. Very unlikely, I'd say.
No.
So there's probably a longer period of amalgamation, of transition. Some of the buildings stick around. Some of them are transitions into churches. The Pantheon in Rome is an example of that. That had, we're told, statues of Augustus and Agrippa not in the centre of the cult. That was left to the other gods, which again brings us back to the question you were asking about the differentiation and the modesty. But that obviously was transformed into a church, and that's pretty much why we still have it today.
And is there any other legacy that this cult leaves us?
I mean, I think the idea, sort of the cult of personality.
Yes, I was going to say the personality cult, indeed. Yeah, you see it I suppose you even see it with US presidents or whatever.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I don't think the imperial cult invented it, because they're picking up on other precedents, but they certainly, set out some of the ideas of honours, prestige and appearance that bear quite a lot of similarities, yes, to things that continue ongoing. We might think about sort of transitions to patron saints as well. What happens when you no longer have the traditional Roman gods, or belief in the traditional Roman gods and the emperors, who looks after different trades and different groups and different people. So there's probably a transition into that as well.
And how were these imperial cults, and I stress the plural there, how were they used to solidify the power of the empire?
I mean, I think that works through everybody is paying honour to the same figures. So no matter whether exactly the way they honour and they worship are different, there is a common thread that's running throughout, that everybody is paying homage, paying loyalty, showing loyalty, and raising these individual figures together. So whether that's Augustus, it usually tends to be the Emperor Augustus, or his heirs, that appears in the Latin West, in Italy, and out in the Hellenistic East, even if the specific ways in which the imperial cult manifests itself, it is still there. So there is some connection that you could probably, if you happen to be somebody traveling, you could probably find some similarities, even if it was just in the figure and the depiction of the emperor, even if the rituals might be slightly different.
So it's a means of manifesting common loyalty.
Yes. So yes, you can find someone to worship, someone to connect, whether or not that's required. And it probably isn't, at least not in the early imperial cult. You're probably not actually going to be told off if you haven't been worshipping Augustus. But it's certainly a symbol. That you can find perhaps Roman-style temples across the empire, or Hellenistic and Roman-style temples, including in France, modern France, and examples still survive. So yes, an element of that it is a way, if you want to show loyalty, you certainly can. So if you need your city to, get a new aqueduct, it might not be a bad thing to have an imperial cult honour to be able to sweeten the deal to the emperor if you're asking for a bit of cash.
And do you find it useful when we talked about anachronism before? We talked about the idea of having the perspective of a Roman. But on the other hand, Do you also find it useful to look at contemporary examples of something that approximates that kind of cult?
Comparative study.
Yeah.
It's tricky to do because every culture is so very different and in with its own time. Say the imperial cult of the 1st century CE is wildly different to that of the 3rd.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's something to be said. Some people I haven't done it, but some people have done some very interesting research to try and see if there are some comparisons to be drawn out that work or don't work. And I think the interesting thing is looking at that. When doesn't that model work for this place or this time and does for that? So actually, I've relatively recently looked at some aspects of kingship, divine kingship in that sense. The danger I always think of comparative work is when you forget to look for the differences as well as the similarities, when you start forcing a culture into a different model, which is not quite a fit. But if you push hard enough and cherry pick and ignore that little bit and emphasize this bit, it works. So people who can do it are doing a very good job of managing to balance that. But for me, it's always the interesting thing of the things that don't fit.
Yeah.
What is the difference and why is it different in the Hellenistic East, the Latin West, in Rome? That's always a bit that interests me.
That's the fascination of the past.
Yes. Why is that the thing that resonates with this time, these people, and these
That's
places?
fascinating. Amber Gartrell, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.